According to the Bible, humanity began in paradise, a perfect garden. No suffering, no hunger, no violence, no death. But strangely, the first true story ever told about mankind is not about peace. It is not about wisdom. It is not about love. And it is not about survival. It is about jealousy. It is about rejection. It is about one brother standing over the body of another. According to the book of Genesis, this was the first murder in human history. Cain, the first son of Adam and Eve, the first man ever born into the world, the first human being raised outside of Eden, and perhaps the first person destroyed by envy. But here is the terrifying question. Was Cain truly evil? Or was he simply the first human being unable to survive the pain of feeling unwanted? For thousands of years, Cain has been remembered as a monster, a cursed man, a murderer, a warning to humanity. But the deeper you study this story, the more uncomfortable it becomes, because the Bible never fully explains why God rejected Cain. Think about that. Abel's sacrifice was accepted. Cain's was not. No detailed explanation, no long conversation, no clear reason, only rejection. And maybe that is why this story still feels disturbingly modern. Because even today, people break under rejection. Not everyone reacts with violence, but many people slowly collapse inside. A friend becomes successful. A coworker receives recognition. Someone else gets chosen. And quietly, something begins to grow in the human heart. Not hatred at first, just comparison. Why them? Why not me? That question alone has destroyed relationships, friendships, families, and entire nations. Perhaps that is why the story of Cain and Abel survived for thousands of years, because it reflects something ancient inside human nature. Even civilizations completely separated from the Bible told similar stories. In ancient Egypt, there was Osiris and Seth. In Roman mythology, Romulus killed his own brother Remus. Again and again, human history repeats the same pattern. Blood between brothers. Violence inside the family. Jealousy turning into destruction. Which raises another possibility. What if Cain was never meant to represent just one man? What if Cain represents a part of humanity itself? A part that still exists today? Because the truth is, most people will never commit murder. But many people understand envy. Many understand rejection. Many understand the silent pain of watching someone else become what they wish they could be. And maybe that is what makes Cain dangerous. Not because he feels inhuman, but because he feels familiar. According to Genesis, Cain was born after Adam and Eve were cast out of Eden. He never saw paradise. He never knew perfection. All he knew was hardship, labor, sweat, and the shadow of his parents' failure. Imagine growing up hearing stories about a perfect world that existed before you were born, a world your parents lost forever. Imagine carrying that weight every day. The first family in human history was not a peaceful family. It was a family built on guilt. Adam and Eve had disobeyed God. They had been expelled from paradise. And now their children were forced to live in a world filled with suffering. Perhaps Cain inherited more than pain. Perhaps he inherited disappointment. And maybe that disappointment slowly became anger. The Bible says Cain worked the ground, day after day, under the sun, fighting cursed soil just to survive. Meanwhile, Abel became a shepherd. One brother worked with the earth, the other worked with living creatures. And then came the moment that changed everything. The offering. Both brothers brought sacrifices before God. Abel offered the firstborn of his flock. Cain offered fruits from the ground. Then something happened that would alter human history forever. God accepted Abel, but rejected Cain. And in that moment, something inside Cain began to break. The Bible describes it in only a few words. Cain was very angry, and his face fell. But those words may describe one of the most important psychological moments in human history, because this may have been the first moment a human being truly believed, "I am not enough." And perhaps that feeling is older than civilization itself. People often imagine evil as something dramatic. But most darkness begins quietly. A silent comparison, a hidden humiliation, a wound nobody else can see. Maybe Cain did not wake up wanting to kill his brother. Maybe he simply could not escape the growing belief that he was less loved, less valued, less worthy. And the frightening part is this: many people still live with that same feeling today. The modern world changed technology. It changed governments. It changed cities, but it never changed the human heart. People still compare themselves to others, still crave recognition, still suffer silently when someone else succeeds. And sometimes, the deepest wounds are invisible. The story says Cain later spoke to Abel and led him out into the field. The Bible gives almost no details, no description of the argument, no explanation, just silence. Then suddenly, Abel is dead. The first blood in human history had entered the earth, not through war, not through politics, not through survival, but through envy. And maybe that is why the story still matters. Because Cain's greatest danger was not his strength. It was the pain he allowed to grow unchecked inside himself. Perhaps that is the real warning hidden in Genesis. Not simply that humans are capable of violence, but that untreated resentment can slowly transform ordinary people into something unrecognizable. And maybe the most terrifying part of all is that Cain never truly disappeared. Because somewhere, deep inside every human being, there is still a voice asking, "Why not me?" Before there was war, before kingdoms rose and collapsed, before humanity built cities, temples, and empires, there was a family. Just one family. And inside that family, something began to rot. According to the book of Genesis, Cain was the first son of Adam and Eve, the first child ever born into the world. Imagine the weight of that existence. No history behind you, no civilization, no language refined over centuries, no laws, no culture, no understanding of what it meant to be human. Cain belonged to the first generation, forced to discover life through suffering, because his parents had once lived in Eden. But Cain never did. He grew up hearing stories about paradise from people who had lost it forever. Stories about rivers of abundance, about walking beside God, about a world untouched by pain. But those stories were not his reality. His reality was hard ground, sweat, exhaustion, silence. The Bible says the ground itself had been cursed after Adam and Eve's disobedience. That meant every harvest required struggle. Every meal required labor. Every sunrise brought another battle against the earth itself. And Cain inherited that burden. Day after day, he worked the soil beneath a burning sky. His hands became rough. His body hardened. His life revolved around survival. Meanwhile, his younger brother Abel chose a different path. Abel became a shepherd. While Cain wrestled with the earth, Abel moved among living creatures. The contrast between the brothers is subtle but important. Cain worked with cursed soil. Abel worked with breathing life. One struggled against death, the other nurtured life. The Bible never says the brothers hated each other. In fact, it says almost nothing about their relationship before the tragedy. And maybe that silence matters, because most hatred does not begin openly. It grows quietly, slowly, invisible at first. Perhaps Cain once protected Abel. Perhaps Abel admired his older brother. Perhaps they laughed together beside the fire at night. Perhaps Cain taught Abel how to survive in the wilderness. But something changed. And like many tragedies, the change began with comparison. One day, both brothers brought offerings before God. Cain brought fruits from the ground he cultivated. Abel brought the firstborn of his flock. 2 brothers, 2 sacrifices, 2 acts of devotion. Then came the moment that altered human history forever. God accepted Abel's offering, but rejected Cain's. The Bible never fully explains why. That mystery has disturbed readers for thousands of years. Why Abel? Why not Cain? Was Abel more sincere? Did Cain offer less than his best? Was God testing him? Or was something deeper happening? The text gives no clear answer. And perhaps that uncertainty is intentional, because rejection often feels exactly like that in real life. No explanation, no closure, just silence. Imagine Cain standing there, watching Abel's offering accepted, watching his own ignored. Imagine the humiliation, the confusion, the shame, especially as the older brother, especially after years of labor, especially after spending his life fighting cursed ground just to survive. For the first time in history, a human being may have experienced the unbearable feeling that someone else was favored over them. The Bible says, Cain became very angry, and his face fell. It is a simple sentence, but psychologically, it may describe the birth of resentment itself. Cain's anger did not appear suddenly. It came from wounded pride, from rejection, from comparison, and perhaps from something even deeper, the fear that he would never be enough. Then comes one of the strangest moments in the story. God speaks directly to Cain, not with punishment, not with condemnation, but with warning. Why are you angry? God asks him. Sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it. That sentence is terrifying, because it describes evil not as something distant, but as something waiting patiently inside the human heart, not forcing its way in. Waiting, watching, growing. And Cain stood at a crossroads. He could confront the pain inside himself, or let it consume him. But pain left untreated rarely disappears. It transforms. The story then becomes unsettlingly quiet. Cain speaks to Abel. The Bible records almost nothing about the conversation. No details, no argument, no shouting. Only a single line. Cain said to his brother Abel, "Let us go out into the field." That silence makes the moment even darker, because violence often arrives quietly, not with chaos, not with dramatic speeches. Sometimes evil walks calmly beside you, into an empty field. Imagine Abel following his brother, trusting him completely. Why would not he? Cain was family, the first brother in human history. And somewhere beneath the open sky, away from their parents, away from home, Cain attacked him. The Bible gives no description of the murder itself. No weapon is mentioned. No final words from Abel. Only the outcome. Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. And with that act, humanity crossed a line for the very first time. The first human death was not natural. It was chosen, not by disease, not by disaster, but by another human being, by a brother. Imagine the silence afterward, the wind moving across the field, blood sinking into the earth. Cain standing over the body, perhaps breathing heavily, perhaps shocked by what he had done, perhaps unable to fully understand that death now existed because of him. Until that moment, death had been an idea. Now it had a face. Abel's face. Then God speaks again. But this time, the tone has changed. "Where is your brother Abel?" And Cain answers with one of the coldest sentences in human history. Do not Am I, my brothers, keeper? That line still echoes through civilization today, because it reveals something deeply human: the attempt to escape responsibility, the refusal to confront guilt. Cain lies, not only to God, but perhaps to himself. Then comes the judgment. God says, "What have you done? Your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground." That image is powerful, the earth itself becoming a witness. Asks if violence leaves scars not only on people, but on reality itself. Cain is then cursed. The ground he once worked will no longer yield its strength to him. The soil that already resisted him will now reject him completely, and Cain is condemned to become a wanderer, a restless man without belonging. But then, something unexpected happens. Cain becomes afraid, not of God, not of punishment, but of other people. He says, "Whoever finds me will kill me." And this creates one of the strangest mysteries in Genesis. Who were these other people? If Adam, Eve, Cain, and Abel were the first humans, who exactly was Cain afraid of? For centuries, theologians and scholars debated this question. Some believe other generations had already been born by this point. Others argue the story is symbolic rather than literal. But regardless of interpretation, the fear itself matters. Because for the first time in history, the murderer realizes something terrifying. Violence creates more violence. Cain feared becoming the victim of the same hatred he unleashed himself. Then comes another unexpected moment. God places a mark upon Cain, a sign that no one should kill him. This has been debated for centuries. What was the mark of Cain? A physical sign, a spiritual curse, a symbol of shame. Nobody truly knows. But one detail changes the entire emotional tone of the story. God does not kill Cain. Despite the murder, Cain is allowed to live, to wander, to carry memory, to carry guilt, to carry himself. And perhaps that punishment was worse than death, because some burdens cannot be escaped externally. They live inside the mind. Imagine Cain years later, walking through empty lands, remembering Abel's face, remembering the field, remembering the moment everything changed. The Bible later says Cain built a city, which is deeply ironic. The first city in biblical history may have been founded by the first murderer. If civilization itself emerged from humanity's brokenness. And perhaps that is one of the darkest ideas hidden in Genesis. Human progress does not erase human nature. People build cities, empires, technology, religion, law. But the human heart remains capable of the same darkness. That is why the story of Cain and Abel still feels disturbingly modern. Because it is not merely about murder. It is about comparison, about rejection, about wounded pride, about emotional pain turning into destruction. Most people will never kill another human being. But many understand what Cain felt before the murder. The jealousy, the humiliation, the quiet resentment, the feeling that someone else is more loved, more valued, more chosen. And perhaps that is what makes Cain terrifying. Not because he feels like a monster, but because he feels human, too human. The story forces an uncomfortable question upon every generation. How much darkness can grow inside an ordinary person before it finally consumes them? And maybe the most chilling part of all is that Cain's story was never truly about the past. Because every age still creates new versions of Cain. People who feel invisible, rejected, forgotten. People who slowly allow bitterness to replace compassion. People who convince themselves that someone else's success is the reason for their suffering. And once resentment becomes identity, destruction often follows. The story of Cain and Abel may be ancient, but emotionally, it never stopped happening. Every family carries conflict. Every society carries envy. Every human heart struggles with comparison. And somewhere deep within that ancient field, the story still waits, not as mythology alone, but as a reflection of humanity itself. The story of Cain and Abel is one of the oldest narratives in human civilization. For thousands of years, people have debated the same questions. Did Cain really exist? Did these events truly happen? Or is this story something else entirely? A symbolic warning, a moral allegory, a reflection of human psychology hidden inside mythology. What makes the story fascinating is not only its religious importance, but how strangely familiar it feels across ancient civilizations. Because long before modern historians began studying Genesis, cultures across the ancient world were already telling stories about violence between brothers. And that raises an uncomfortable possibility. Perhaps Cain and Abel were never just biblical figures. Perhaps they represented a truth humanity had already recognized long before the Bible was written. To understand that possibility, we must travel back thousands of years, to the cradle of civilization itself, Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, modern-day Iraq. This region gave birth to some of humanity's earliest cities: Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, Assyria. These civilizations emerged thousands of years before modern nations existed, and with them came something revolutionary: writing. For the first time in human history, people began recording myths, laws, prayers, fears, and stories onto clay tablets. Many scholars believe parts of the book of Genesis may have been influenced by older Mesopotamian traditions, not copied directly, but shaped within the same cultural atmosphere. And when researchers compare Genesis to ancient Near Eastern literature, the similarities become difficult to ignore. The Epic of Gilgamesh, for example, contains a massive flood story remarkably similar to Noah's Ark. Ancient Sumerian texts describe divine punishment, human corruption, and gods interacting with mankind. Again and again, themes found in Genesis appear across older civilizations, which forces historians to ask, was Genesis preserving ancient memories shared across cultures? Were these stories symbolic attempts by early civilizations to explain the human condition? The Cain and Abel story may belong to that same tradition, because beneath the surface of the narrative lies a conflict that shaped the ancient world itself. The struggle between farmers and shepherds. Cain is described as a worker of the ground. Abel is a keeper of sheep. At first glance, this sounds like a simple detail, but historically it may reveal something much larger. In the ancient Near East, agricultural societies and nomadic shepherd tribes often lived in tension with one another. Farmers settled permanently. They built villages. They claimed land. They depended on crops and stable territory. Shepherds lived differently. They moved constantly with their flocks. They followed seasons and grazing routes. They valued mobility over ownership. And throughout ancient history, these two lifestyles frequently clashed. Disputes over land, water, and territory were common. Some historians believe Cain and Abel symbolically represent these two worlds. Cain representing agriculture and settlement. Abel representing pastoral nomadic culture. If that interpretation is true, then the story becomes more than family tragedy. It becomes a symbolic memory of ancient social conflict, one of humanity's earliest struggles between competing ways of life. But another mystery remains even more disturbing. Why did God reject Cain's offering? The Bible never gives a fully clear explanation, and for centuries, theologians, rabbis, priests, and scholars have debated the meaning of that rejection. Some believe Abel offered his sacrifice with greater sincerity. Others argue Abel gave the best of his flock while Cain merely gave ordinary produce. Certain interpretations suggest blood. Sacrifice was considered more sacred than crops, but none of these explanations are explicitly stated in the text itself. That silence matters, because ambiguity creates interpretation, and interpretation creates centuries of debate. Some Modern scholars argue the story intentionally leaves the rejection unexplained because the emotional focus is not on God's reasoning, but on Cain's reaction. The true danger in the story may not be rejection itself, but how humans respond to rejection. And psychologically, that makes the narrative timeless. Even today, people rarely become destructive simply because they suffer. They become destructive because suffering feels unfair. That feeling exists throughout the Cain narrative. Cain works, struggles, offers devotion, yet Abel is favored instead. Whether the rejection was justified or not, Cain experiences humiliation. And humiliation has always been one of the most dangerous human emotions. Historically, societies collapsing into violence often begin with collective humiliation. Wars, revolutions, extremist movements, mass violence. Many are fueled not only by suffering, but by wounded pride. That is one reason the Cain story continues to resonate deeply across centuries. It speaks to something psychologically ancient inside humanity. But perhaps the strangest archaeological problem surrounding Cain is this: there is absolutely no direct historical evidence that Cain existed. No inscriptions, no tomb, no city clearly connected to him. No archaeological proof for Adam, Eve, Abel, or Eden. For some believers, this does not weaken the story, because they see Genesis as sacred truth regardless of material evidence. Others interpret the early chapters symbolically rather than historically. And many scholars take a middle position. They believe Genesis preserves ancient cultural memory wrapped inside theological storytelling. This is important to understand. Ancient texts were not written the same way modern history books are written today. The goal of ancient writers was not always strict historical documentation. Their stories often blended history, theology, symbolism, morality, and identity into a single narrative. In the ancient world, symbolic truth and historical truth were not always separated. A story could communicate profound truths about human nature, even if every detail was not literally historical. And the Cain story may be one of the clearest examples of that. Because whether Cain existed or not, humanity continues repeating his story, again and again, across every civilization, across every century, across every ideology. Brother against brother, family against family. People destroying each other because of resentment, jealousy, and wounded identity. Even outside the Bible, similar patterns appear constantly. In Egyptian mythology, Seth murders his brother Osiris out of rivalry and power. In Roman legend, Romulus kills his brother Remus during the founding of Rome. In Greek mythology, family betrayal and bloodshed dominate entire generations of stories. It is as though ancient civilizations collectively understood something terrifying. The greatest human threat often comes from within the family itself. Not strangers, not outsiders, but those closest to us. And perhaps that is why the Cain story feels so intimate, because it is not distant evil. It is personal evil, domestic evil, emotional evil. Another fascinating detail is Cain's punishment after the murder. He becomes a wanderer, a restless exile. In ancient societies, exile was often considered worse than death. Identity depended entirely on family, tribe, and land. To lose belonging meant losing protection, meaning, and purpose. Cain's punishment therefore carries enormous cultural weight. He is separated not only from God, but from stability itself. And psychologically, the punishment reflects the nature of guilt. People often imagine punishment as external pain. But the Cain narrative suggests something darker. The mind itself becomes punishment. The memory, the wandering, the inability to escape oneself. Some scholars even argue the mark of Cain symbolizes the visible burden of guilt carried through life, not merely a curse from God, but the permanent psychological scar left by violence. Over centuries, the phrase "mark of Cain" entered literature, philosophy, and art as a symbol of shame and inner corruption. Painters across Europe repeatedly depicted Cain with hollow eyes, dark landscapes, and expressions of torment. Writers portrayed him not only as evil, but haunted. Because perhaps the most disturbing interpretation of Cain is not that he was born monstrous, but that he became monstrous gradually. And that idea terrifies people, because gradual corruption feels realistic. Human beings rarely become destructive overnight. Most darkness grows slowly, quietly, internally. First comparison, then resentment, then emotional isolation, then hatred, then justification, and finally, violence. This progression appears not only in the Bible, but throughout human history itself. Civilizations, political movements, and even ordinary individuals often descend into destruction through the same emotional pattern. That is why many psychologists and philosophers remain fascinated by the Cain story even outside religious belief. Because the narrative functions almost like an ancient psychological map of resentment. The philosopher René Girard argued that human societies are deeply shaped by rivalry and mimetic desire. People imitate each other's desires. They compare themselves constantly. And eventually, rivalry produces conflict. From that perspective, Cain and Abel become more than biblical figures. They become archetypes of human competition itself. Carl Jung approached biblical stories similarly. He believed ancient myths reflected hidden structures inside the human psyche. In Jungian interpretation, Cain may symbolize the shadow, the dark emotional side humans attempt to suppress. Jealousy, anger, inferiority, violence. Not foreign emotions, human emotions. That interpretation may explain why the Cain story still feels emotionally alive after thousands of years. Because modern society changed technology, but not psychology. People still compare themselves constantly, still seek recognition, still feel invisible, still struggle with resentment when others succeed. Social media intensified this ancient human tendency dramatically. Today, people observe the achievements, beauty, wealth, and success of others every hour of every day. Modern life turned comparison into a permanent environment. And perhaps that is why the story of Cain feels more relevant now than ever before. Not because people literally fear murdering their brothers, but because millions silently experience the same emotional roots. Inadequacy, comparison, humiliation, the fear of not being enough. The story's archaeological uncertainty therefore may not weaken its power. It may strengthen it, because Cain survives not through evidence, but through repetition. Humanity keeps recreating him in workplaces, families, politics, relationships. Entire nations sometimes behave like Cain, resenting the success or recognition of others until bitterness transforms into destruction. And perhaps that is the greatest historical truth hidden inside Genesis. The danger was never only Cain himself. The danger was the part of Cain that exists inside humanity. A part civilization never fully erased. A part history continues revealing again and again. And maybe that is why this ancient story refuses to disappear. Because somewhere beneath all human progress, the same ancient struggle still lives inside the human heart. For thousands of years, the story of Cain has been interpreted in one simple way. Cain was evil, Abel was innocent, and the lesson was clear. Jealousy leads to destruction. But the deeper we examine this story, the more uncomfortable that interpretation becomes, because the truth is, the Bible never describes Cain as a monster before the murder. It never says he was cruel by nature. It never says he hated Abel from childhood. It never even says he lacked faith. In fact, Cain worships God. Cain works. Cain brings an offering. Cain tries, and that changes everything. Because suddenly, the story no longer feels like a battle between good and evil. It feels like something far more dangerous, a story about emotional collapse. And perhaps that is why Cain still disturbs modern audiences. Not because he feels distant, but because he feels understandable. That does not excuse what he did, but understanding darkness is very different from approving it. And maybe that distinction matters, because human beings often prefer simple villains. Simple morality feels safe. Good people, bad people, heroes, monsters. But real human psychology is rarely that clean. Real darkness usually grows slowly, quietly, internally. And Cain may be one of the earliest examples of that process ever recorded. The traditional religious interpretation is straightforward. Cain became jealous of Abel. Instead of mastering his emotions, he allowed sin to control him. God even warned him beforehand. Sin is crouching at your door. Cain ignored the warning. Then he murdered his brother. From this perspective, Cain represents humanity's first moral failure after Eden. The first time inner corruption turned into violence. And honestly, that interpretation is not wrong. Jealousy is dangerous. History proves this repeatedly. People destroy friendships over envy. Families collapse because of resentment. Wars begin because nations cannot tolerate the success or power of others. Human beings often become cruel, not because they are starving, but because they cannot bear seeing someone else rise higher than them. From that perspective, Cain becomes timeless, a warning about the destructive power of comparison. But there is another side to this story that many people avoid discussing. A much more uncomfortable side. Why did God reject Cain? That question changes everything, because the text never clearly explains it. Think about how psychologically devastating that moment must have been. Cain spent his life working cursed ground, fighting the earth just to survive. Then he brings an offering before God, and he is rejected. Meanwhile, his younger brother is accepted, chosen, favored. Imagine standing there in silence, watching someone else receive approval while you receive nothing. No explanation, no comfort, no understanding, just humiliation. And maybe that is why some modern readers sympathize with Cain more than ancient audiences did. Because many people today understand rejection deeply, especially invisible rejection, the kind that slowly destroys self-worth. People spend years trying to prove themselves, trying to matter, trying to be enough. Then someone else receives the love, the promotion, the success, the recognition, and suddenly all the buried insecurity rises to the surface. That emotional experience feels painfully modern. Some psychologists argue that humiliation is one of the most dangerous emotional states human beings can experience. Not sadness, not grief. Humiliation. Because humiliation attacks identity itself. It creates the feeling that one's existence lacks value. And throughout history, humiliated individuals and humiliated societies often become unpredictable. Violence frequently grows from wounded pride. Revenge often begins with emotional shame. Perhaps Cain experienced something similar. Again, this does not justify murder, but it may explain the emotional pathway toward it. And understanding pathways toward darkness matters, because if evil is only viewed as something monstrous and alien, people fail to recognize its early stages inside ordinary life. That may be one reason the Cain story remains psychologically important. It reveals how emotional pain can slowly mutate into destruction when left unresolved. Another uncomfortable question emerges from the story. Did Cain feel loved? The Bible never answers directly, but psychologically the question matters. Cain was born after humanity's fall from Eden. His parents lived with guilt, with shame, with loss. Adam and Eve were no longer innocent beings in paradise. They were traumatized survivors of exile, and trauma changes families. Children often inherit emotional burdens from parents who never healed themselves. Modern psychology understands this deeply. Pain passes through generations. Fear passes through generations. Shame passes through generations. Perhaps Cain inherited more emotional damage than we realize. Imagine growing up in the shadow of a lost paradise. Imagine constantly hearing stories about what humanity once was, while living in hardship yourself. Perhaps Cain felt disconnected from both God and his parents long before Abel died. And maybe Abel unintentionally became a symbol of everything Cain believed he lacked. Approval, acceptance, favor. This is where the story becomes frighteningly modern. Because many people today do not truly hate others. They hate what others represent. Someone else's beauty becomes a reminder of insecurity. Someone else's success becomes a reminder of failure. Someone else's happiness becomes evidence of personal emptiness. Comparison transforms admiration into resentment, and resentment slowly poisons perception. That poison may have consumed Cain long before he entered the field with Abel. There is another detail people rarely discuss. God warns Cain before the murder. This is psychologically fascinating. The warning suggests Cain still had a choice. His emotions were real, but they were not destiny. Anger itself was not the sin. What he did with anger became the danger. That distinction matters enormously. Modern society often misunderstands emotion. People fear anger, fear jealousy, fear darkness inside themselves. But emotions are not automatically evil. They become dangerous when denied, buried, or allowed to grow unchecked. Cain may represent the first human being unable to process emotional pain in a healthy way. Instead of confronting his suffering, he externalized it. Instead of asking, "Why am I hurting?" he unconsciously decided, "Abel is the reason I hurt." That psychological shift is incredibly important, because many destructive people believe their suffering was caused entirely by others. Once someone becomes convinced another person is responsible for their emotional pain, violence becomes easier to justify. History repeatedly demonstrates this pattern. Political extremism, ethnic violence, revolutions, terrorism, personal revenge. All often begin with resentment searching for a target. Cain found his target in Abel. And perhaps that is why the story still matters, because the emotional mechanism behind it never disappeared. But now we arrive at the most uncomfortable interpretation of all. What if Cain was not uniquely evil? What if Cain was simply human without wisdom? Human without emotional maturity? Human without the ability to confront shame properly? That possibility changes the entire emotional weight of the story. Because if Cain was purely monstrous, audiences can distance themselves from him. But if Cain was ordinary, then the story becomes personal. Too personal. Most people have never murdered anyone, but many understand envy. Many understand rejection. Many understand the painful feeling of watching someone else become what they desperately wish to be themselves. That emotional experience is nearly universal, which means the line between ordinary pain and destructive resentment may be thinner than people want to believe. Some philosophers argue the Cain story is ultimately about identity. Cain wanted proof that he mattered. When Abel was accepted instead, Cain interpreted it not merely as disappointment, but as evidence of personal failure. And that is where comparison becomes deadly. Healthy identity allows admiration without self-destruction. Unstable identity turns another person's success into personal humiliation. Modern culture intensifies this problem dramatically. Social media created endless comparison. People now observe the achievements of others constantly. Wealth, beauty, relationships, recognition, success. Every scroll becomes another opportunity for insecurity. And psychologically, many people live closer to Cain's emotional state than they realize. Quiet resentment, silent inadequacy, the feeling of being unseen while others are celebrated. That does not make them evil. But it does reveal how emotionally fragile human beings can become when identity depends entirely on external validation. Perhaps that is why Cain's face fell, as the Bible describes. Not merely because he was angry, but because rejection shattered his sense of self. And maybe the real tragedy of Cain is not simply that he killed Abel. Maybe the deeper tragedy is that Cain never learned how to survive emotional pain without becoming consumed by it, because pain itself is unavoidable. Every human being experiences rejection eventually. Failure, humiliation, loss, comparison. But unresolved, pain becomes dangerous, especially when mixed with pride. There is another reason some modern readers feel sympathy for Cain. After the murder, God punishes him, but also protects him. That detail is deeply strange. Why protect the first murderer? Why place a mark upon Cain so nobody would kill him? Perhaps because the story is more complicated than simple condemnation. Perhaps even Cain remained human in God's eyes. Broken, dangerous, guilty, but still human. And that idea is deeply uncomfortable. Because society prefers clean separation between good people and bad people. But reality is rarely clean. Human beings carry both light and darkness simultaneously. Compassion and resentment, love and envy, mercy and cruelty. The Cain story forces audiences to confront that duality. And maybe that is why it survived for thousands of years. Not because it explains murder, but because it explains human fragility. At its core, the story may ask a terrifying question. What happens when emotional pain grows faster than emotional wisdom? Cain could not control the suffering inside himself. Instead of confronting his wounded identity, he destroyed the person who reflected it back to him. And perhaps humanity has repeated that pattern ever since. Nations do it. Communities do it. Families do it. Individuals do it. People often attack what exposes their insecurity, not because others are evil, but because they mirror something painful internally. That is why Cain remains psychologically alive, not as a historical figure alone, but as an emotional archetype. The rejected self, the resentful self, the wounded self searching for someone to blame. And maybe the scariest part of the entire story is this. Under the right conditions, almost anyone can begin walking toward the same field Cain entered long ago. Not literally with violence, but emotionally, spiritually, internally. The field where comparison becomes resentment. Resentment becomes hatred, and hatred slowly destroys everything human inside us. Perhaps that is why the story of Cain still refuses to disappear, because civilization advanced. But the human heart did not evolve nearly as much as people pretend, and somewhere beneath modern society, beneath technology, beneath progress, beneath civilization itself, the ancient struggle inside Cain still survives. The story of Cain and Abel may be thousands of years old, but emotionally, it feels disturbingly modern. Because beneath the ancient language, beneath the symbolism, beneath the theology, the story is ultimately about something deeply human. What happens when pain is left alone for too long? Most people listening to this story will never commit murder. Most people are not violent criminals. But that is not why Cain matters. Cain matters because almost everyone understands the emotions that came before the violence. The comparison, the rejection, the humiliation, the silent feeling that someone else is becoming what you wanted to become yourself. That emotional experience exists everywhere today. At work, inside families, on social media, in friendships, in relationships. People constantly measure their worth against the lives of others. And modern society has turned comparison into a permanent lifestyle. For most of human history, people compared themselves only to a small group around them. Their village, their tribe, their local community. But today, person can wake up and compare themselves to millions of strangers within minutes. Someone richer, someone more attractive, someone more successful, someone happier, someone more loved. The human brain was never designed for endless comparison. Yet modern life feeds comparison constantly. Every scroll becomes a reminder of what someone else has achieved. And slowly, without realizing it, many people begin living exactly like Cain. Not physically, emotionally. Quiet resentment begins growing inside them. A feeling that life has favored everyone else. A belief that they themselves are falling behind. And the dangerous part is this: most resentment begins silently. Nobody wakes up evil. Nobody suddenly transforms overnight. Darkness usually grows slowly. First disappointment, then comparison, then insecurity, then bitterness, then emotional isolation. And eventually, people stop seeing others as human beings. They begin seeing them as obstacles, symbols, reminders of personal failure. That transformation is psychologically dangerous. Because once another person becomes a symbol of your pain, resentment becomes easier to justify. That is why unresolved emotional suffering matters so much. The Cain story teaches something modern culture often ignores. Pain that is denied does not disappear. It mutates. People who cannot process rejection properly often become emotionally destructive. Not always toward others, sometimes toward themselves. Many people today live with hidden anger. Not explosive anger, quiet anger. The kind hidden behind smiles, routines, and normal behavior. People continue working, continue functioning, continue pretending everything is fine. But internally, resentment keeps growing. And over time, unresolved resentment changes perception. It changes personality. It changes relationships. Some people become cold. Others become cynical. Others begin sabotaging the people around them. Some destroy relationships because another person's happiness reminds them of what they lack. Some secretly celebrate when others fail. Some become addicted to criticism because attacking others temporarily relieves feelings of inferiority. These emotional patterns are far more common than people admit. And perhaps that is why the Cain story still feels so real. Because Cain's greatest battle was not with Abel. It was with himself. The field was only the final stage. The real tragedy began much earlier. Inside his mind. One of the most important lessons hidden in the story is this: comparison destroys identity. When people define their worth entirely through comparison with others, peace becomes impossible. Because there will always be someone more successful, more talented, more attractive, more admired. A person trapped in constant comparison can never truly rest. And modern society encourages this endlessly. Children are compared in school. Adults are compared in careers. People compare wealth, appearance, relationships, followers, achievements, lifestyles. Entire identities become dependent on external validation. But external validation is unstable. It changes constantly. And one's self-worth depends entirely on approval. Rejection becomes emotionally catastrophic. Perhaps that is exactly what happened to Cain. Maybe Abel's acceptance did not merely disappoint him. Maybe it shattered his identity completely. That possibility still exists today. Many people build their entire sense of value around achievement, recognition, or success. Then when rejection finally comes, they collapse internally. Some become depressed. Some become angry. Some isolate themselves. And some unconsciously search for someone to blame. The human mind often struggles to accept painful truths internally. It is easier to project pain outward, to believe, my suffering exists because of someone else. This psychological mechanism appears everywhere. In toxic relationships, in politics, in online culture, in extremist movements. People in pain often seek targets, someone to carry responsibility for their emotional suffering. And once resentment finds a target, dehumanization becomes easier. That is one reason the Cain story is still profoundly relevant. It reveals how emotional wounds can slowly transform into moral blindness. Cain stopped seeing Abel as a brother. He began seeing him as the reason for his pain. That shift changed everything. Modern life creates similar conditions constantly. Social media intensifies insecurity. Consumer culture intensifies inadequacy. People are constantly reminded of what they do not have, what they have not achieved, what they failed to become. And many suffer silently because modern society rewards appearances more than emotional honesty. People learn to hide weakness, hide loneliness, hide shame. But hidden pain rarely disappears. It accumulates. And accumulated emotional pain often emerges in indirect ways. Passive aggression, cruel humor, emotional manipulation, bitterness, online hatred, addiction, self-destruction. The Cain story reminds us that human beings are psychologically fragile when they lose connection to meaning and self-worth. And perhaps that is why emotional awareness matters so much. Cain was warned before the murder. That detail is incredibly important. God tells him, "Sin is crouching at your door." In modern psychological language, we might describe this differently. Uncontrolled emotion was already growing inside him. The warning suggests Cain still had responsibility. His pain was real, but pain itself did not force his actions. That distinction matters deeply, because modern culture sometimes confuses emotional suffering with moral permission. Suffering explains behavior, but it does not automatically justify destructive behavior. Cain's pain was understandable. The murder was still wrong. That balance is essential. Otherwise, humanity falls into dangerous thinking. If I suffer enough, I have the right to harm others. History repeatedly proves where that mentality leads. One of the darkest human tendencies is transforming personal pain into justification for cruelty. That is why emotional maturity matters. Emotionally mature people acknowledge pain without allowing pain to control their morality. They confront resentment before it becomes identity. They process rejection without turning bitterness into purpose. And that may be the real lesson hidden inside the Cain story. Not that humans experience darkness, but that humans must learn responsibility for their darkness. Because everyone carries emotional pain eventually. Everyone experiences unfairness. Everyone experiences rejection. The question is not whether pain exists. The question is what people do with it. Cain allowed his suffering to define him completely. And once suffering becomes identity, destruction often follows. Another powerful lesson from the story is the danger of isolation. Cain appears emotionally alone long before the murder. The text never describes him expressing vulnerability, never describes healing, never describes emotional support, only growing anger. That pattern still exists today. Many people isolate themselves emotionally when hurting, especially men. Modern culture often teaches men to suppress vulnerability completely, to remain silent, to endure pain privately. But silence can become psychologically dangerous. Pain hidden for too long often transforms into emotional numbness or rage. And perhaps Cain represents one of humanity's earliest examples of emotional isolation turning destructive. The inability to speak honestly about suffering can slowly deform a person internally. This matters enormously today, because modern society is experiencing increasing loneliness despite constant digital connection. People communicate constantly online, yet many feel deeply unseen. They compare endlessly, yet rarely feel understood. And hidden loneliness often intensifies resentment. A person who feels disconnected from meaning, purpose, and human connection becomes psychologically vulnerable. Perhaps that vulnerability existed inside Cain long before Abel died. There is another lesson modern society desperately needs. Another person's success is not your failure. Cain interpreted Abel's acceptance as evidence of his own inadequacy. That emotional mistake still destroys people today. Someone else's beauty does not diminish yours. Someone else's success does not erase your value. Someone else's happiness is not proof that you deserve suffering. But insecurity distorts perception. Insecure people often experience life as competition. They believe worth is limited. Approval is limited. Love is limited. Recognition is limited. And once life becomes a competition for worth, other people become threats instead of companions. That mindset creates endless emotional exhaustion. The Cain story exposes how destructive that worldview can become. Because Cain could no longer celebrate Abel. He could only compare himself against him, and comparison slowly poisoned love itself. Perhaps that is why genuine gratitude is psychologically powerful. Gratitude interrupts comparison. It reconnects people with meaning beyond status and recognition. People consumed entirely by comparison eventually lose the ability to appreciate life at all. Nothing feels enough. There is always another person to envy, another achievement to chase, another reminder of inadequacy. Modern society often mistakes ambition for identity, but ambition without emotional stability can become dangerous. People begin chasing validation instead of purpose, and validation is addictive. No amount ever feels sufficient. Cain may have wanted more than acceptance. Perhaps he wanted proof that he mattered. And many people today secretly crave the same thing. To feel chosen, seen, valued, worthy. The tragedy is that external approval can never permanently solve internal insecurity. Only self-awareness can confront that darkness honestly. That may be why the Cain story still survives after thousands of years. Because it reveals something timeless about human beings. People are not destroyed only by suffering. They are often destroyed by the meaning they attach to suffering. Cain interpreted rejection as proof of personal worthlessness. Then he allowed that interpretation to reshape reality itself. And perhaps modern humanity still does the same thing constantly. People build identities around failure, around rejection, around humiliation, around resentment. And eventually bitterness becomes more familiar than hope. That is why emotional responsibility matters, not perfection. Not pretending darkness does not exist, but confronting darkness before it takes control. The story of Cain is ultimately not just about violence. It is about the human struggle to carry pain without becoming consumed by it. And perhaps that struggle never ended, because even now, thousands of years later, humanity still stands in the same field. Still wrestling with envy, still wrestling with rejection, still wrestling with the ancient question hidden inside Cain's heart. If someone else is chosen, what does that mean about me? Perhaps the most disturbing part of the story of Cain and Abel is not the murder itself. It is the realization that humanity has never truly escaped that field. Thousands of years have passed. Civilizations have risen and fallen. Empires disappeared. Technology transformed the world. Human beings walked on the moon, built artificial intelligence, connected billions of people through invisible networks. And yet, the human heart still struggles with the same darkness. People still compare themselves to others, still feel invisible, still crave recognition, still suffer silently when someone else succeeds. The world changed externally, but internally humanity remains painfully familiar. That may be why the story of Cain still feels alive. Because Cain is not terrifying simply because he killed. Cain is terrifying because his emotions feel recognizable. The insecurity, the rejection, the wounded pride, the silent resentment. Most people will never commit physical violence, but many know what it feels like to smile while secretly feeling inferior. to congratulate someone while quietly questioning their own worth, to wonder why life seems easier for everyone else. And maybe that is where the story becomes dangerous. Because resentment rarely announces itself openly. It grows in silence, slowly, patiently. At first, it sounds harmless. Why not me? Then, over time, that question becomes heavier, more emotional, more personal. Why are they loved? Why are they chosen? Why do they matter more? And if those emotions remain untreated long enough, they can reshape an entire personality. The story of Cain is not merely about violence. It is about what happens when emotional pain becomes identity, when suffering is no longer something a person experiences, but something they become. Cain could no longer see Abel simply as his brother. Abel became a reflection of everything Cain believed he lacked. And once another human being becomes a symbol of personal failure, love begins to die. That pattern still exists everywhere today. Families divided by jealousy, friendships destroyed by comparison, relationships poisoned by insecurity, entire societies consumed by resentment. Human beings often destroy what they secretly envy. And perhaps that is why the Bible presents Cain's story so early in human history. As if to say, before humanity built nations, before politics, before religion, before civilization itself, there was already conflict inside the human heart. Maybe that has always been the real battlefield. Not land, not power, not wealth, but the internal war between gratitude and resentment, between humility and pride, between emotional responsibility and emotional collapse. And perhaps the most tragic part of Cain's story is that he was warned. The darkness did not appear suddenly. It was growing long before Abel died, which means the real danger was never the final act. The real danger was the silence before it, the resentment left unspoken, the pain left untreated, the insecurity left to grow alone in darkness. That lesson may matter now more than ever, because modern society often teaches people to hide suffering instead of understanding it, to perform strength instead of seeking healing, to compare constantly instead of living honestly, and many people quietly carry emotional wounds nobody else sees, smiling publicly, breaking privately. The frightening truth is that human beings are capable of adapting to hidden bitterness. People can live with resentment for years without realizing how deeply it changes them, until eventually, they no longer recognize themselves. Perhaps that is why the story never truly ended, because Cain still exists. Not as one man wandering ancient lands, but as a possibility inside every human being. The possibility of allowing pain to become hatred. The possibility of turning insecurity into resentment. The possibility of believing another person's existence is the reason for our suffering. And maybe the true purpose of the story is not simply to condemn Cain, but to warn us before we become him. Because the line between pain and destruction is thinner than people want to believe. Every human being carries darkness. Every human being carries insecurity. Every human being faces rejection eventually. But not everyone allows suffering to consume their humanity. Perhaps that is the final lesson hidden inside Genesis. The real battle was never between Cain and Abel. The real battle was inside Cain himself. And maybe that same battle still exists inside all of us. So perhaps the most important question is not, was Cain evil? Perhaps the real question is, what happens to a human soul when pain is left alone for too long? And maybe that is the question humanity is still trying to answer today.